The iron lock had fused with the wood over time, sealing the trunk as though it wished to keep every memory buried a little longer. When the estate auctioneer pried it open in the summer of 1912, dust rose in a slow-moving cloud, gray as old breath. The crowd leaned forward, expecting linens or letters, the soft ghosts of a long-dead Southern family. Instead, they saw a bundle wrapped in a length of faded cotton, child-sized, stained, and tied with a knot so tight it had cut into its own fabric. Inside lay a small pair of shoes, hardly worn, and beneath them a red clay-flecked shawl. But the item that silenced the room was a brittle page torn from a plantation ledger, the ink warped by damp. 3 names had once been written there, aligned in a trembling row. Only one remained legible. The other 2 had been scratched out, violently, as if someone had tried to gouge the paper into forgetting. Pinned to the page was a note written in a woman's hurried hand. "I had no choice. May God forgive this house." The auctioneer felt the weight of 100 unspoken histories press against him, and for a fleeting second he thought he heard something. An echo, a cry, the faint rustle of feet that were never meant to stand on this earth. He set the items aside, throat dry, suddenly aware that he held evidence of a story no one in the county had ever told aloud. One of the oldest families in Georgia, revered for their Confederate dead and generous church donations, had guarded a secret so terrible it made the air of the old hall feel colder. The trunk would later be purchased by a traveling historian who traced the note back to 1847, to the woman who had written it, and to the triplets she bore in chains, one pale enough to pass, 2 dark enough to doom. The historian's search would unravel a tale of terror, cruelty, and choices no mother should ever have been forced to make. A tale that whispered beneath the floorboards of Georgia for generations, buried under prayers, property lines, and the silence of those who believed forgetting was easier than reckoning. Before we continue with the story of the woman known in surviving records only as Mira, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. And on. The year was 1847, and Georgia lay heavy with the heat of late summer, the kind that curled the air and thickened the scent of pine and tobacco. In the countryside beyond Milledgeville, the state capital at the time, plantations sprawled in every direction, their fields etched like scars into the landscape. Rows of cotton stretched beneath a white sun that punished man and soil alike. From a distance, the great houses glimmered with an almost sacred stillness. Wide porches, painted shutters, columns that imitated the temples of ancient empires. But closer, the illusion fractured. The sound of iron striking wood, the cough of overworked lungs, the rustle of chains carried along the wind. The wealth that built those columns came from backs that were bent and blood that had no legal claim to justice. Georgia in 47 was a place in tension, though few dared speak it. The whispers of abolition were drifting down from the north like an early frost. Newspapers argued bitterly, some declaring that slavery was the backbone of the Southern way of life, others warning that the nation was courting damnation. Church sermons in the region strained to justify human bondage with Scripture, insisting that God had ordained each race to its rightful place. In the same breath, they preached mercy, charity, and the sanctity of family. Outside their doors, families of the enslaved were broken apart at auction blocks every week. Milledgeville itself bustled with contradictions. On court days, the square overflowed with farmers, lawyers, tradesmen, and enslaved people carrying baskets or leading horses for their masters. The taverns smelled of sour ale and pork fat, mingling with the sharper scent of ink from the print shops. Ladies in wide skirts strolled past the storefronts, parasols angled against the sun, their voices soft and composed. Just beyond the neat brick streets, cabins hunched beside rivers where enslaved mothers washed clothes in silence, the water darkening with the dyes of worn fabric. Nightfall brought its own textures. Cicadas droned in vast waves. Lanterns flickered in the windows of the great houses like watchful eyes. On the plantations, the enslaved quarters glowed with faint firelight, gatherings of families speaking in low tones, telling stories of ancestors and spirits that traveled through the trees. Some said you could hear warnings in the wind if you listened closely enough, omens carried from the swamps, from the unmarked graves, from those who had resisted and suffered. The law offered no refuge for the enslaved. Under Georgia statutes, a child inherited the status of its mother. A woman like Mira, born into bondage, could bear no free child. Her joys and sorrows were the property of another. Her womb, in the eyes of the courts, belonged to the owner of the plantation. Slaveholders kept detailed ledgers listing births as increases, not blessings. When a woman conceived, the calculation began immediately. What profit the child might yield, how its skin would appear, whether it could work the fields or be sold at a favorable price. The plantation where Mira labored sat near the Oconee River, a sprawling estate owned by the Holt family, old money even then, though its origins were stained with duels, land disputes, and one rumored murder that the locals rarely mentioned above a whisper. Their main house rose on a hill, its facade immaculate, its interiors adorned with imported wallpaper and carpets from France. Visitors praised its elegance without acknowledging the human suffering concealed behind its whitewashed beauty. Slaves on the Holt property remembered the place differently. The creak of the overseer's boots, the smell of boiled cane and sweat, the sharp, metallic scent of the branding iron used in years past. Some spoke of the eldest Holt son, a man whose presence made silence fall like a shadow. Others feared the matriarch, known for her rigid faith and colder temperament. They said she hid her cruelties with prayer, whispering verses that could freeze a room. Children born on that land were catalogued with the same precision as cattle. Names were often given by their mothers, but entries in the ledger recorded them with numbers or crude descriptions. Male, dark, or female, light, suitable for house. It was within those pages, now brittle with age, that Mira's tragedy took its first written breath. Mira herself had been brought to the plantation at 14. She was slight but strong, with high cheekbones and a quiet gaze that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. Older women in the quarters spoke kindly of her, noting how she sang to calm the younger children on stormy nights. To the overseer, she was dependable, never shirking her duties. To the Holt family, she was invisible, until the day her belly began to swell. The spring of 1847 carried rumors of unrest. A nearby plantation had suffered an outbreak of illness that killed 2 infants. A patrol discovered strange symbols carved into the bark of trees along a county road. Symbols no one recognized. Church pastors preached about spiritual decay creeping through Georgia, urging their congregations to strengthen their resolve. Yet daily life continued its heavy rhythm on the Holt land, the fields demanding every ounce of strength from dawn until dusk. It was during this season, beneath the constant drone of cicadas and the humid press of the Georgia air, that Mira's pregnancy approached its end. None among the enslaved women could remember a time when a mother had carried triplets. Few dared to speak of the implications. Children born with different skin tones, some pale, some dark, were not uncommon on plantations, but they were always dangerous reminders of what the owners refused to admit. Mixed blood complicated everything. It exposed sins the law pretended did not exist. The midwife in the quarters, an older woman named Aunt Scylla, sensed trouble long before the birth began. "The air ain't right this year," she whispered one evening as she laid a cool cloth on Mira's forehead. "I see things in my sleep, shadows moving where there shouldn't be shadows." Mira nodded, saying nothing. She felt a heaviness in her chest, a cold fear that grew each night as her time approached. She prayed silently for her children, though she feared God might not hear her on this land. In the great house, The Holt family held their own concerns. Mrs. Holt paced the parlor, her hands clasped around a rosary. "It's indecent," she murmured to her husband one night. "These situations reflect poorly on us." Her husband, a man who had mastered the art of emotional absence, replied only, "See that it's handled quietly." Their son, sitting in the corner with a tumbler of rum, watched the exchange with a faint smirk. "Nature will take its course," he said. The words made the missus flinch. The birth would come on a night thick with thunder, a storm that rolled across the fields as though heaven itself had turned its back on the land. And what happened in that storm? The choices forced upon a mother who held 3 innocent lives in her trembling arms would haunt the Holt estate for decades. The storm that night had been only the beginning. By the time dawn pushed its pale light across the Holt plantation, the land seemed to hold its breath. The cotton fields looked washed, muted, their edges blurred by the earlier rain. Smoke from the slave quarters drifted slowly upward, carrying the smell of wet ash and boiled cornmeal. People moved with the quiet heaviness that follows a night of sleepless fear. Word had spread in uneasy murmurs. Mira had delivered 3 children, and something about the birth had disturbed even the bravest among them. To understand the full weight of what happened on that night, we must step into the lives of those who shaped it, those who bore witness, those who turned away, and those who ensured that what followed would never make its way into polite conversation. Mira was 20 years old by the summer of 1847, though hardship had carved lines into her expression that made her seem older. Her skin was a warm shade of copper, her eyes dark and steady. Those who lived alongside her said that strength came off her in waves, quiet but unmistakable, like a hum beneath the surface of everything she did. She laughed rarely, smiled sparingly, but when she spoke, her voice carried softness, like water over stone. Years earlier, she had been forced into housework, but was later sent back to the fields, an unspoken punishment for something she had never admitted. Some whispered that she had refused the advances of a white man. Others claimed she had been caught teaching a child to read using a scrap of an old Bible. Mira herself never confirmed any of it. She kept her stories locked behind her eyes. Her closest friend in the quarters was Aunt Scylla, a midwife with hands as sure as carved oak, and a voice that could quiet babies faster than any lullaby. Scylla had delivered hundreds of children over her lifetime, some into freedom of spirit, others into despair. She saw patterns in births the way some saw patterns in clouds or cards, and she feared what Mira's swelling belly meant. 3 at once is a sign, she muttered more than once, running her thumb over the smooth knob of a wooden charm she kept in her apron. A sign of trouble or change, and this land don't take kindly to either. Mira would respond with the same words each time, murmured almost as a prayer. "I want them to live." Scylla would look at her with a sorrow that held centuries. "Livin' ain't always what folks imagine, child." There was another woman, younger than Scylla and older than Mira, known as Ruthie. She worked the dairy sheds at the edge of the Holt property. Ruthie was gentle, soft-spoken, with a kind of fragile hope that clung to her even when she tried to hide it. She often checked on Mira during the pregnancy, bringing small offerings, a handful of berries, a cloth dipped in lavender, a whisper of comfort. "You'll be all right," Ruthie said one afternoon as she massaged Mira's swollen hands. "God don't send what we can't bear." Mira met her gaze with a heaviness Ruthie struggled to understand. "Sometimes I think God don't see us here." Ruthie didn't respond. She had heard similar words from others, but hearing it from Mira, the quiet heart of their small community, made her throat tighten. Though the enslaved women shaped the emotional core of this story, they were not the only figures whose actions would ripple across the coming horror. The Holt family existed in 2 contradictory forms, the refined public mask and the private rot beneath it. The patriarch, Virgil Holt, was a man of imposing stillness. He had the kind of presence that seemed carved from stone, tall, rigid, eyes a washed-out blue that revealed nothing. He believed in order, in hierarchy, and in a God who mirrored his own sternness. He rarely raised his voice, yet the threat of his anger was enough to make overseers step back. The Mrs. Eleanor Holt had once been known for her beauty, but by 1847, her face had hardened into something severe. Her hair was always pinned in tight coils, her dresses immaculate, her posture impossibly straight. She read scripture every morning at the same hour, and if she discovered dust in the parlor afterward, she would summon the nearest enslaved girl with a voice sharp as shattered glass. But her temper was not what made people uneasy. It was her devotion, quiet, desperate, and laced with a fear she never named. She prayed as though God were a witness she needed on her side. Their only son, Lucian Holt, was 26, and carried himself with the entitled swagger of a man whose cruelties had always been shielded by family wealth. He was handsome in a cold, careless way, with dark hair, a narrow jawline, and a gaze that slid across people instead of meeting them. He drank every evening, often drifting into the quarters late at night under the excuse of checking on the workers. Everyone knew what that meant, though no one dared speak it aloud. Even the overseer avoided confronting him. It was Lucien who had paid particular attention to Mira in the winter months before her pregnancy began. His eyes would linger too long, his breath scented with rum as he spoke to her in low tones that made her skin crawl. "You're a quiet one," he said one evening as she polished the wood banister. "Quiet girls pay attention. They know their place." Mira kept her eyes on the floor. "Yes, sir." He touched her arm, a fleeting brush, but enough to make her step back. He smirked. "Nothing to be afraid of. Obedience keeps things peaceful." She said nothing. Words would have changed nothing anyway. When her pregnancy became visible, Lucian acted indifferent, but the older women saw the tension in his jaw when he walked past her. They saw the missus's gaze linger coldly, calculatingly, each time Mira entered the big house to carry water or sweep the floors. And they saw Virgil Holt quietly tearing a page from the ledger one evening and slipping it into a drawer, the same page later discovered in that auctioned trunk. The plantation's overseer, Thomas Brack, was a man of contradictions. Cruel with the lash, yet occasionally merciful in ways that puzzled those around him. He wore a hat that sat crooked on his head, smelled perpetually of tobacco, and spoke with a slow drawl that hid more intelligence than he liked to admit. He knew that Mira's unborn children threatened the plantation's carefully constructed facade. He knew what pale skin could reveal. One afternoon, as he watched Mira hauling water with effort, he murmured to no one in particular, "This is going to bring a reckoning." He spat into the dirt. And reckoning never falls on the ones that earned it. There was one final figure whose presence would become pivotal, Reverend Shanks, the local minister who traveled between plantations to preach obedience and salvation. He was a thin man with a fervor that bordered on fever. His sermons were filled with fire, with declarations that God had marked every person for a divine purpose. He often visited the Holt family for supper, speaking in hushed tones with Eleanor Holt. Rumors whispered that he performed rites rarely acknowledged by the Methodist Church, rituals meant to chase away spiritual corruption. It was said he once tried to cleanse a child born unusually pale on another plantation. That child vanished within the month. Reverend Shanks spoke kindly to the enslaved when white ears were near, but in private, he used scripture like a knife. "Sin manifests in blood," he told Eleanor during one visit, unaware that Scylla was passing just outside the parlor window. "When the line is blurred, God demands correction." Eleanor's reply trembled like glass. "I fear correction is coming." Every life on the plantation, Mira, Scylla, Ruthie, Virgil, Eleanor, Lucian Dean, Brack, the Reverend, became a thread in the tapestry that surrounded those triplets. The birth had not yet become the horror it would soon turn into, but its shadow had already begun to stretch across the land. 3 children entering the world with 3 different shades of skin was more than a matter of gossip. It was evidence. It was a threat, and it was a catalyst. On the morning after the storm, when Scylla finally stepped out of Mira's cabin, sweat still glistening under the creases of her brow, she saw Ruthie waiting outside with trembling hands. "Is she alive?" Ruthie asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Scylla nodded, though her face was carved with worry. "Mira's alive. The babies, too." "3?" Ruthie whispered. "All 3. Scylla hesitated. "But the first one, the one that came quickest." She looked toward the big house, her eyes tightening. "That child's skin is near white." Ruthie lifted her hand to her mouth. Scylla spoke again, voice low. "Trouble's comin'. You tell no one what you saw last night. No one." Ruthie swallowed and whispered, "I won't." But Ruthie was not the only one who would learn the truth. A single overheard sentence was enough to unleash the fear that had been simmering beneath the plantation's genteel facade. Lucian Holt stood at the edge of the porch as Scylla returned to the cabin, and he muttered to himself, "White as me, that can't be allowed." He turned, jaw tightening. Mother needs to know. And with that, the wheels of an unthinkable decision began to turn. A decision that would haunt the land for decades, until the evidence surfaced again in that forgotten trunk. The day after the birth, the plantation seemed to fall into an unnatural quiet. It was the kind of stillness that people feel in their bones before they understand its cause. A hush that smothers conversation, thickens the air, and makes sound travel strangely. Even the birds in the pines seemed reluctant to call out, as though afraid to draw attention to themselves. The enslaved workers sensed the shift before they heard a single word from the Holt family. Something dark had settled over the land. By mid-morning, the rumor had taken shape, growing like mold in the damp corners of shared fear. 3 babies, not 2, not 1, 3. And the first had skin lighter than a spring peach blossom. A child born to a woman who had no claim to freedom, yet whose features mirrored those of her owner's bloodline. It was a whisper so dangerous that even speaking it aloud felt like a sin. Scylla remained inside Mira's cabin for most of that day. She sat beside the pallet where the mother slept, exhausted beyond measure. The babies lay wrapped in cloth, all 3 impossibly small. 2 had the rich brown tone of Mira's family, but the third, the firstborn, looked like a white planter's child, his skin pinkening as he breathed, his hair already tending toward a light flaxen brown. Scylla stared at him with an expression that mixed awe, fury, and dread. "You gon' be the death of somebody?" she whispered, not unkindly, but with a sorrow carved deep in her voice. Mira stirred then, her eyelids fluttering open. Her voice was hoarse. "Are they all here?" "Yes, child." Scylla leaned close. "All 3. Mira reached for the smallest of them, the pale infant, the one whose existence threatened everyone around him. She traced a trembling finger along his cheek. "He's mine," she whispered. "All of them are mine." Scylla exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "Be careful, Mira. Love don't protect our kind on this land." Outside the cabin, Ruthie waited again carrying a tin cup of water. When Scylla stepped out to fetch air, Ruthie approached her. "How is she?" "She's breathing, but trouble's moving like a storm cloud to the big house," Scylla answered. She wiped the sweat from her brow. "Mrs. Holt seen the children yet?" Ruthie shook her head. "Not yet, but Lucien went inside early. His boots were muddy. He goes fast when he's angry." "Lord help us," Scylla murmured. At the big house, Eleanor Holt paced the parlor, her rosary clutched tightly in her hand. Her breath was shaky, the beads clicking rapidly under her fingers. Lucien stood by the window, staring out toward the slave quarters, jaw clenched. "It's obvious what's happened," he said in a low, tight voice. "You saw Mira these past months. You knew. Eleanor snapped her head toward him. I knew only what any decent Christian woman observes, but I do not speak what cannot be proven. Lucian laughed bitterly. You don't have to speak it. The whole county will speak it for you if that child is ever seen. Eleanor approached him slowly. And what do you suggest? Throw all three to the river? Lucian hesitated. 2, he said quietly. The white one is the only child that matters. If he survives, the rest will be forgotten. Eleanor recoiled. You speak madness. That child, Lucian interrupted, is the only thing that can keep this family's reputation intact. A pale boy born of a slave won't shame us the way a dark one fathered by a Holt would. Eleanor closed her eyes, her lips trembling. Virgil must decide this. I won't bear the weight of it alone. Lucian smirked slightly, seeing victory in her hesitation. Father will do what he must. He always does. Eleanor turned away, clutching the rosary with white knuckles. Pray for their souls, she whispered. Pray for ours. But Virgil Holt had already made his own judgment long before the conversation finished. He sat in his study, ledger open, quill hovering just above the page. When Lucien entered, he spoke without looking up. The pale one stays, he said simply. The others. He paused, finally lifting his gaze. His voice was as cold as river stone. Their absence will not be questioned. Lucian nodded, satisfied. Virgil closed the ledger with deliberate calm. Send for Reverend Shanks this afternoon. Lucian's smile faltered. Reverend Shanks? For what? Virgil dabbed his quill in ink. For counsel, and perhaps for absolution. Lucian's voice sharpened. What absolution is needed? They are slaves. Their offspring are our property. Virgil Holt met his son's eyes with a rare flicker of something. Disgust or warning. It was hard to tell. Every man answers for the blood he spills, Lucian, even when the law calls it righteous. Lucian swallowed and stepped back. He left the study quickly, a troubled look crossing his face for the first time since morning. Meanwhile, in the quarters, unease had turned into outright fear. The enslaved workers gathered in small clusters between chores, exchanging glances heavy with warning. No one dared speak too loudly. The children played more quietly than usual, as though sensing the tension that clung to the adults. Scylla, standing outside Mira's cabin, looked at the sky. I feel eyes on us, she murmured. Ruthie nodded. Everybody do. Even the trees look like they watchin'. Before noon, Thomas Brack, the overseer, approached the cabin. His boots crunched on the damp ground. The door creaked open as Scylla stepped forward protectively. Ain't no call for you here yet, she said firmly. Brack raised both hands slightly, his voice unusually gentle. I'm just checking. The Holts want an update. Scylla narrowed her eyes. And what you want? Truth, he said. Whatever it is. Scylla studied him for a long moment, trying to read the sincerity in his expression. Brack was not known for kindness, but he was also not known for the zeal that burned in Reverend Shanks or the cold arrogance of Lucian Holt. He had grown up poor, working fields not very different from those he now oversaw. He understood suffering because he had lived close to it. Something about him, despite his cruelty, seemed troubled by the events unfolding. He leaned closer. Miss Scylla, what I hear in the big house, it ain't good. Scylla's jaw tightened. What you hear? That decisions are being made, he said quietly. Decisions that can't be undone. Scylla closed the door slightly, blocking his view into the cabin. You ain't taking none of them babies. Brack shook his head. I ain't the one you should fear, but if they send me down here later, I can't stop what I'm ordered to do. His voice cracked a little, and he cleared his throat quickly to hide it. You understand me? Scylla's breath trembled. I understand. Brack stepped back, took a final look at the cabin, and walked away, his shoulders heavy, his steps slow. Inside, Mira lay awake now, nursing one of the dark-skinned infants. Her face was pale with exhaustion. "I heard voices," she whispered as Scylla re-entered. "Just Brack," Scylla said. "And trouble." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "They want my babies." Scylla sat beside her, pressing a hand to her arm. "What they want and what they get ain't always the same, Mira." But her voice lacked conviction. As the afternoon stretched on, a strange tension moved through the plantation like a sickness. Doors in the big house opened and closed in hurried patterns. Mrs. Holt called for the maid 3 times in an hour, each request more frantic than the last. Lucien paced between the veranda and the stables, muttering under his breath. And Virgil Holt rode out toward the edge of the property to meet Reverend Shanks, the 2 men speaking in low tones that carried no farther than the hooves of their horses. By sunset, the enslaved workers had begun to sense that something unnatural was unfolding. They felt it in the sudden chill of the air, in the way the shadows stretched long despite the lingering light, in the faint tremor in Mira's voice when she whispered to her babies, "I won't lose you." That night, the first strange rumor began. A young boy named Caleb, no older than 8, told Scylla he had seen a figure standing near the tree line. "It was tall," he said, trembling, "and it was watching your cabin. Didn't move, didn't blink." Scylla shook him gently by the shoulders. "Hush that talk. It was just the reverend." Caleb's voice dropped to a frightened whisper. "It weren't no reverend? It didn't look like a man." Scylla swallowed, looking toward the dark edge of the woods. She felt the cold creep down her spine. "Go on," she whispered. "Get inside. Say your prayers." Later, long after the children were asleep, a woman in the quarters claimed she heard something moving near the well. Soft footsteps, followed by the sound of a baby crying, though Mira's children were asleep. Another woman said she saw a candle flickering in the big house attic, a place where no servant was allowed, and where no one had gone in years. Each small rumor fed the next, creating a web of unspoken dread. And by dawn, it was no longer just fear of the Holt family's decisions. It was fear of something else. Something that had begun moving in the dark. Something that everyone felt, but no one yet understood. The night that followed did not begin with screams or storms, but with a quiet wrongness, an unsettling sense that something had stepped onto the Holt plantation that did not belong to the living. The first signs were small, like cracks forming in a wall long before it collapses. It began just before midnight, when the cicadas, loud all day, fell silent all at once. Not gradually, not fading. Simply stopping, as though someone had pressed a hand over their thousands of tiny throats. Scylla, sitting beside Mira and humming softly to lull the infants, noticed it instantly. Her voice trailed off, replaced by a cautious stillness. Only the faint rasp of Mira's weary breathing filled the room. "You hear that?" Scylla whispered. Mira nodded. Even exhausted, her instincts sharpened like an animal sensing a hunter. "It's too quiet." Outside, the quarters felt suspended in a strange, breathless pause. Shadows stretched longer than they should have beneath the moon. The air hung heavy, unmoving. No one stirred except Ruthie, who had woken abruptly from a dream she could not fully remember, only that she had seen water rising and hands reaching up from beneath it. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out of her cabin. The moonlight glinted off something near the well. She squinted, uncertain. At first, she thought it was a lantern, but lanterns did not sway like that. They did not breathe. "Who's there?" she called softly. The shape stilled. Then, in a voice that seemed both near and far, someone whispered, "Mama." Ruthie's breath caught. The voice was small, familiar, but it wasn't Mira's infants. Those were all inside, asleep, and the voice had come from near the well, not a cabin. She took a hesitant step forward. "Caleb, "Is that you, child?" No answer. Only a faint drip of water from the old wooden bucket hanging off the rope. She stepped closer, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As she reached the well, she saw the source of the glimmer. The rope, wet and slick, though the bucket rested firmly in place. Ruthie reached out with trembling fingers, touching the rope. It was cold, unreasonably cold, as though pulled from deep winter. When she looked down into the well, the darkness seemed to recoil, a quick withdrawal, like something had moved just out of sight. "Mama, help!" This time the voice floated up with greater clarity, curling around her like breath on the back of her neck. Ruthie staggered backward, nearly falling. The moment her foot touched the dirt again, the cicadas began to sing once more in one frightening, unified wave. From Mira's cabin, the first baby stirred and wailed. Ruthie fled inside, slamming the door. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, she wasn't the only one unnerved by strange happenings. Caleb, the boy who had claimed to see a figure in the trees, refused to leave his mother's side. His wide eyes darted between shadows, as though expecting a hand to reach out from them. When Scylla asked what troubled him, he only whispered, "It came back." Before Scylla could ask what he meant, Ruthie burst in with the story of the well. Some dismissed it as nerves, others as a dream, but Scylla did not. Her hands tightened around the charms hidden in her apron pocket. "Mira," as Scylla said later that morning, "you remember dreaming anything? Hearing anything?" Mira shook her head. "Only the babies fussing." Scylla hesitated. Sometimes, when a soul is in danger, the air listens different. It carries things it shouldn't. Mira's eyes drifted to her children, particularly the pale one. "It's because of him," she whispered. "Ain't it?" Scylla didn't answer. At the big house, Eleanor Holt was also having a restless morning. She had slept little, her dreams plagued by visions she refused to acknowledge. Visions of water flowing red and pale hands reaching from beneath it. She found Lucien already pacing the hallway when she descended the stairs. "You heard it last night?" he asked without greeting. "Heard what?" "The crying." He rubbed his temples. "A baby crying somewhere outside, but when I looked, nothing." Eleanor froze. "Don't speak of that." He turned sharply toward her. "Mother, something is happening on this property. Something that began the moment those children were born." Eleanor stepped back from him slowly, as though recoiling from a truth she didn't dare name. "You're letting superstition cloud your judgment." Lucian's laugh was brittle. "Superstition? You think the workers are the only ones who hear things?" Eleanor swallowed, glancing toward her husband's study. "Your father won't tolerate such talk." Lucian's voice dropped to an angry whisper. "Then he can tell whatever is lurking out there to obey him. But I don't think it answers to any Holt." Their argument was cut short by a sudden loud crash from upstairs, a sound like a heavy piece of furniture tipping over. They both rushed up the staircase. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. No one had opened it in years. Eleanor grabbed Lucien's arm. "Don't!" But Lucien pushed the door wider and stepped inside. Dust motes swirled in the morning light. Old trunks lined the walls. A broken cradle leaned against a beam. The attic held decades of forgotten remnants. But one thing did not belong. A small indentation in the dust. The clear impression of a barefoot child's footprint. Eleanor's voice cracked. "It's just rats." Lucian crouched, touching the footprint. Rats don't have toes. Down in the quarters, Ruthie found Scylla again. "It weren't a dream," she insisted. "Something was at that well." Scylla pressed her palm against Ruthie's cheek, comforting her. "Child, sometimes spirits wander near birthing places, especially when the children ain't meant for this world." Ruthie looked stricken. "Don't say that." Scylla didn't answer. She only stared toward Mira's cabin with a grave expression. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Mira stepped outside for the first time since the birth. Her legs were weak, but she needed air. She sat in the shade of a tree, the pale infant bundled in her arms. His skin glowed faintly in the warm light. Ruthie sat beside her. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Mira nodded but didn't smile. "Scylla says trouble comes looking for children like him." Ruthie hesitated. "Do you think trouble is coming?" Mira didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the big house, where a curtain fluttered in the second-floor window, though the breeze was still. Inside that window, someone watched her. Not Eleanor. Not Lucienne. Not Virgil. A small silhouette, unmoving, its head tilted slightly, as though studying her. Mira blinked. The silhouette vanished. Her breath hitched. "Ruthie, take him." Ruthie gently took the infant, confusion crossing her face. "What is it?" I saw a child in the window." Ruthie followed her gaze. "But the Holt children been grown years now." "I know what I saw," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. That night, another incident rippled through the quarters. A woman named Hester woke screaming that someone had touched her feet as she slept. When she lit her candle, she saw tiny, muddy footprints on her cabin floor, leading to her bed, then back toward the door. No child in the quarters had shoes that small. By the following morning, the whispers were no longer dismissible. Something was moving through the plantation, something tied to the birth of those triplets. Something that wanted to be noticed, something that felt old. Everyone sensed it. Even the land itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. And each passing hour tightened the noose around Mira and her babies. For whatever had awakened was not finished yet. And soon, the Holt family's terrible plan would intersect with something far more dangerous than any of them understood. The third day after the birth began like a held breath, tight, tense, and waiting to break. A thin fog clung low to the ground, lifting in slow coils as the sun pushed through. The workers moved uneasily, stealing glances toward the big house, toward the tree line, toward Mira's cabin. Everyone sensed that something was coming. Even the animals seemed disturbed. The horses snorted restlessly in their stalls, and the dogs barked at shadows that held no shape. By sunrise, the entire plantation felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Scylla was the first to notice the sign. She stepped out of Mira's cabin to fetch water and stopped dead when she saw the ground just beyond the doorway. 3 small footprints pressed into the damp dirt, 1 larger, 2 smaller. The soil was disturbed, as though something had stood directly in front of the door for several minutes before stepping away. But the prints weren't fresh. They were dried at the edges, as if they had been there for hours, maybe since the dead of night. Scylla muttered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, shelter this house." Inside, Mira rocked her children with trembling arms. The pale infant slept peacefully, but the other 2 stirred restlessly, whimpering in their sleep. "What's wrong?" she asked Scylla as soon as she stepped inside. Scylla shook her head. Just the morning. But her eyes were shadowed with fear, and Mira saw it. Meanwhile, the Holt household was already unraveling. Lucien had not slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair uncombed, his shirt wrinkled where he had clutched it with anxious hands. He ate nothing at breakfast, merely pushed his food aside while watching the window. "It's watching me," he said suddenly, voice taut as wire. Eleanor stiffened. "Stop." "I'm telling you the truth." He leaned forward. "That child in the attic." "It was not a child," Eleanor snapped. "You saw dust. You saw your imagination." Lucian's hand slammed against the table. "I know what I saw. and I heard someone walking the upstairs hall last night. Barefoot? Eleanor's face drained of color. You went upstairs? No, he said. Something else did. Virgil entered then, as cold and composed as ever, a stark contrast to the chaos boiling beneath his roof. Enough, he said quietly. There are decisions to be made. I will not tolerate hysteria. Lucien rose from the table, his voice sharp. You don't feel it because you don't listen, but something's in this house. Virgil walked past him toward the study. What's in this house is the consequence of your actions. Lucien followed quickly, hissing under his breath. Mine? You dare. But the door closed before he finished. Eleanor flinched at the sound. Lucien stood there for a long moment, shaking with anger. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Lucien turned sharply. Nothing moved. But he felt watched. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear crack open inside him. Over in the quarters, Ruthie gathered water at the well, her eyes darting nervously to the bucket that had once dripped cold water in the dead of night. She avoided looking down into the darkness, but she couldn't help glancing once. Just once. The well stared back, dark and silent. And then, a ripple. Not of water. Of something shifting just beneath her line of sight. She jerked back, spilling half the bucket. Scylla, she whispered when the older woman approached. There's something wrong with the water. Scylla looked down. The well water glinted peacefully, as normal as any day. You ain't sleeping enough, Scylla said gently. Your mind's playing tricks. Ruthie swallowed. You don't believe that. Scylla didn't answer, because she didn't believe it either. By midday, the tension on the plantation had reached a point where even the overseer, Thomas Brack, avoided meeting anyone's gaze. He walked the fields with his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched, as though expecting violence at any moment. He stopped at Hester's cabin to check on her. The woman who had woken screaming about someone touching her feet now stood barefoot outside her door, staring at the ground. Her expression was distant, hollow. You all right? Brack asked. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the ground. They came back. Brack crouched to look. There they were, tiny footprints, trailing toward the tree line. Brack swallowed hard. Children been running around here? Hester shook her head. Ain't no child on this place with feet that small. Brack straightened slowly, his skin cold. And then he heard it. From deep within the woods, a sound like a soft whimper. Then a faint giggle. Low, uneven, unnatural. Brack spun. Who's there? Silence. The woods held their breath. He stepped backward toward open ground. Stop this foolishness, he muttered under his breath. Ain't nothing out there but... The giggle returned. Closer. Brack cursed softly and hurried back toward the clearing. Whatever was in those woods did not belong to this world. And he knew it. By late afternoon, Reverend Shanks arrived, summoned by Virgil Holt with a terse note delivered before dawn. The Reverend rode in on a skeletal horse, his face gaunt and ashen, his eyes burning with fervor that bordered on fever. When he dismounted, he took one slow look around and murmured, A shadow lies thick upon this land. Scylla saw him from a distance and felt her stomach drop. Reverend Shanks had a reputation for purifying troubled places, though his methods were rarely spoken of. Some said he sought out spirits, that he called them forth instead of banishing them. Others said he sensed sin the way dogs sensed storms. And if he had come for the babies... Fear twisted Scylla's gut. Eleanor Holt greeted him at the door. Reverend, thank heaven you've come. The house feels... He raised a hand to silence her. I know, he whispered. The air speaks. Eleanor shivered. "Where is the girl?" he asked. Eleanor's breath caught. "Which?" "The mother," he said. "The mother of the pale child." Eleanor hesitated. "She is in the quarters." "Then the corruption begins there." Eleanor flinched. "Corruption?" Reverend Shanks stepped past her without waiting for permission. "Do not hide truth in the walls of this house, Eleanor Holt. It rots the soul." Eleanor's face paled to a sickly white. Lucien approached from the hallway, stiffening when he saw the Reverend. "What are you doing here?" Shanks turned slowly to face him. "Your father summoned me." Lucien scoffed. "Of course he did. He hides behind sermons when he should—" "When he should what?" Shanks interrupted. "Face his sins openly, or bury yours alongside them." Lucien stiffened. "Watch your tongue." Shanks smiled thinly. "I watch everything." At that exact moment, the sound of a baby crying echoed faintly from the quarters, one of Mira's infants awakening. Shanks' head snapped toward the sound, and when he turned back, his smile had vanished. "I must see them," he said quietly. Lucien stepped forward. "Absolutely not." Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Lucien." He shook her off, furious. "You think I'll allow him to—" But Virgil Holt appeared in the doorway of his study. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "He will see them." Lucien turned. "Father, this household will not be cursed because of your transgressions," Virgil said. Lucien froze. Eleanor covered her mouth, eyes glistening. Shanks bowed his head slightly. "The truth will be revealed." Virgil gestured toward the door. "Go." Shanks moved toward the quarters, his steps measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Inside Mira's cabin, Scylla lifted her head sharply. She felt it before she saw him. The shift in the air, the way the walls seemed to lean inward, the way the babies stirred restlessly in their blankets. A knock sounded. Slow. Intentional. Scylla opened the door just enough to see him standing there. Reverend Shanks. His gaze was cold, direct, a gaze that saw into a person's marrow. "Scylla," he said softly, "step aside." "No," she answered quietly. He raised a brow. "This is not your decision." "It is," she whispered, "because someone need to stand between you and that woman." From behind her, Mira's voice rose, weak but steady. "Who is it?" Shanks pushed gently past Scylla. His eyes found Mira, and then the babies. The pale one lay in Mira's arms. Shanks froze, and for the first time his expression cracked. A flicker of astonishment. Something like fear, or recognition. He whispered, "It cannot be." Mira clutched her child tighter. "Don't you touch him!" Shanks stepped slowly forward, his breath trembling. "This child is marked." Scylla moved between them again. "Ain't no mark on that baby but the ones this world gave him." Shanks shook his head. "You do not understand. This is not merely sin of the flesh. This is an opening." He pointed toward the pale infant. "Through him, the boundary weakens." Mira's eyes filled with horror. "Boundary?" Shanks leaned forward. "The veil between the living and the lost." Scylla's breath caught. Ruthie, standing in the corner, whispered, "Lord have mercy." Shanks stepped back suddenly, as though struck by a realization. Then he turned and hurried from the cabin, his coat swirling behind him like a black wing. Scylla followed him outside, grabbing his sleeve. "Reverend, what you seeing?" Shanks looked at her with eyes suddenly wild. "Not what I expected. Much worse." "What does that mean?" "It means this land is not haunted by death," Shanks whispered. "It is haunted by what wants to live." He tore his arm free and strode toward the big house. Scylla's skin crawled. Even the trees felt still. Inside the cabin, Mira held her babies close and whispered, "Scylla, what's happening to us?" Scylla swallowed hard. "I don't know." But she did. She knew exactly what was coming. Trouble, judgment, blood. And as night began to fall again, the noises started. Faint tapping against the cabin walls, soft sobs from somewhere in the fields, a long dragging sound from the woods. Every worker heard something. Every animal sensed something. Even the wind felt wrong, carrying whispers that had no source. By the time darkness settled fully over the plantation, the fear that had been simmering for days finally erupted into open, trembling panic. And suspicion tightened its claws around every soul. Because now everyone knew this horror was no longer creeping. It had arrived. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Night on the Holt plantation did not fall. It descended heavy and deliberate, as though something ancient pressed its hands against the sky and forced the darkness down faster than nature intended. The evening insects sang in frantic, uneven rhythm. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners where no light should have reached. Even the lantern flames inside the cabins wavered without breeze. And the moment the last trace of daylight died, the boundary the reverend had spoken of seemed to breathe. Mira felt it first. She sat upright in bed, clutching her infants, her chest rising in sharp, panicked breaths. Something cold brushed the soles of her feet, cold like water from a deep well. The pale child whimpered, eyes fluttering open. One of the darker-skinned twins began to cry. Scylla, half dozing in a chair nearby, opened her eyes. "What is it?" Mira gasped. "Something touched me." The words hadn't fully left her lips before they both heard it. A soft pattering. Tiny feet. Running across the roof. Scylla stood slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the table where she kept her protective charms. The pattering stopped. Silence moved in like a tide. Then, a knock at the door. Soft, rhythmic. Too gentle to be a man. Too deliberate to be the wind. Mira's voice cracked. No, please." Ruthie, who had insisted on staying the night, whispered, "It's a child. It sounds like a child knocking." Scylla shook her head. "Ain't no child knock like that. Not in the middle of the night. Not with something smiling behind it." Another knock. Then, "Mama." Ruthie fell to her knees, hands clasped over her ears. "Not again," she sobbed. "Oh, Lord, not again." Mira pressed her babies closer. Scylla, don't open it." "I ain't," Scylla whispered. "Ain't nobody opening that door." But something else opened. The window. It slid upward with agonizing slowness, inch by inch, though every breeze had died hours ago. The candle flame flickered wildly. Mira screamed, clutching her children. Scylla lunged forward and slammed the window shut, her hands shaking violently. She slid the wooden latch into place. "Ruthie," she breathed. "Hand me the ash." Ruthie scrambled toward the shelf and grabbed a small ceramic jar filled with ash from the hearth. Scylla reached into it and smeared a line across the windowsill. The scratching stopped instantly. Ruthie whispered, "The ash worked." "Maybe," Scylla said. Her voice quivered. "Maybe not." In the big house, Reverend Shanks knelt in the parlor, surrounded by candles arranged in a ring. He muttered scripture under his breath, verses bent and twisted from their proper form. His eyes fluttered open and shut, as though he were battling sleep or vision. Eleanor Holt stood trembling near the doorway. "Reverend, whatever you think you're summoning, I beg you." "I'm not summoning," he snapped without looking up. "I am unmasking." Virgil watched from the staircase, arms folded. "Speak plainly, Reverend. What haunts this land?" Shanks did not look up. Not a ghost, not a demon. Something older. Eleanor gasped. Older than Scripture," he whispered. "Older than the graves on this land. Older than the first slaves brought to these shores. Something that has waited for a doorway." He lifted his head slowly, and the doorway was a berth. Lucien, pacing violently along the far wall, barked, "You're insane! This is nonsense!" "Is it?" Shanks rose to his feet with sudden, unnatural energy. "Tell me, Lucien Holt, what did you bury 10 years ago in these woods?" Lucien stopped dead. His face drained of color. "Do not lie in the presence of God," Shanks hissed. Virgil stepped forward, voice thunderous. "What is he speaking of?" Lucien swallowed hard. "Nothing. Shanks strode toward him. "You buried something you believed forgotten. But the land does not forget. Buried sin does not rest." Lucien backed up until he hit the wall, breath ragged. Eleanor stared at him. "Lucien, what did you do?" Lucien's voice cracked. "I was a boy. I didn't mean—" Shanks pressed his palm against Lucien's chest, forcing him still. "You killed a child!" Eleanor screamed. Virgil's face went ashen. Lucien choked out. "It was an accident. I told the truth. The boy fell. I didn't—" Shanks leaned in close, whispering, "You buried him in the woods, beneath the old sycamore. You covered him with soil, but not with prayer." Lucien trembled violently. "How do you know that?" Shanks' eyes glowed in the candlelight. "Because he is not at rest, and he has come home." Eleanor collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Virgil gripped the banister, knuckles white. Lucien stammered, If a spirit's angry, if it wants revenge—" "It does not want revenge," Shanks interrupted. "It wants completion." "Completion of what?" Eleanor cried. Shanks turned to her, voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "A mother lost her child. A child lost his mother. A soul lost its place. And now, through that pale infant, something can return." Eleanor's breath halted. "Return?" Shanks nodded slowly. "The dead do not seek vengeance. They seek life." Outside, the air thickened. Fog crept low across the ground, spreading from the woods toward the cabins. It rolled like breath, cold, alive, and aware. Hester opened her door to fetch wood, and froze. A small figure stood at the edge of the fog. A little boy, barefoot. His clothes were drenched, clinging to his small frame. His skin was pale, not in the natural way of the children on the plantation, but in the way of something long deceased. Water dripped from his hair onto his shoulders. His head lifted. His eyes were black. Pitch black. Hester screamed, slamming her door and collapsing to the ground. Her neighbors burst in moments later, but the child had vanished. Only small wet footprints remained, trailing toward Mira's cabin. In Mira's cabin, the tension snapped all at once. A loud crack struck the roof, followed by a dragging sound, as though something crawled across the shingles. The infants wailed with such force, Mira nearly dropped one. Scylla shouted, "Ruthie, get the fire built, fast!" Ruthie scrambled to the hearth, fumbling with flint and steel, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the first spark. Another scratch at the door. Another whisper. "Mama?" But this time the voice was clearer. Louder, and not the voice of any living child. Mira sobbed, "He wants the baby, the pale one. He wants my baby." Scylla's eyes widened. "Not your baby, child. He ain't after your baby." Mira stared at her, trembling. "Then what?" "He after what's inside it." Mira's blood turned to ice. Before she could process the words, the latch on the door jerked violently. Once, twice, 3 times. "Ruthie!" Scylla screamed. "More wood!" Ruthie threw logs onto the fire, sparks rising in frantic bursts. The door groaned under the weight of something pushing from outside. Mira clutched her children, sobbing. "Please, please, leave us alone." Then the cabin door burst open. Cold air surged in like a wave. And in the doorway stood the drenched little boy. The dead boy. His head tilted. Water dripped into the dust at his feet. He lifted a trembling hand and pointed directly at the pale infant. Mira screamed, pulling her child close. The boy stepped forward, but before he could cross the threshold, Scylla threw a handful of ash directly into the air between them. It scattered like black snow. The boy recoiled, hissing, retreating a step. His voice warbled like a drowning child. "Mama, be gone," Scylla shouted. "Ain't no home for you here." The boy hesitated. The room fell deathly silent. And then, a deep voice echoed from behind him. "Not human, not child. Give him back." The fog swelled behind the boy, forming the shape of something large. Something adult-sized. Something unfinished. Scylla gasped. Ruthie dropped the poker. Mira collapsed over her children, and the cabin walls shook. Hard. A booming knock sounded on the other side of the doorframe, shaking dust from the rafters. The shape in the fog shifted, preparing to force its way inside. Scylla grabbed a burning log from the fire and thrust it forward like a torch. "Get away from this house!" she screamed. The shadow shrieked, an inhuman sound that tore through the night. It recoiled violently. The fog split apart like torn cloth. The boy vanished. The cold air rushed out of the cabin, and everything fell silent. Completely. Utterly. Silence. Then the baby's cries returned, breaking the stillness. Scylla slammed the door shut, bolting it. Ruthie fell to her knees, shaking. Mira cradled her infants, whispering prayers that broke into sobs. Scylla breathed, "This ain't no ghost." Ruthie whispered, "Then what is it?" Scylla stared at the pale child, her voice low and grim. "It's something that ain't finished, something that ain't whole." She touched the pale infant's cheek with trembling fingers. "And through this baby, it's trying to come back." If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer